And glad to have you, and let's get started. Courtney, can you advance?
Yes.
The vision and mission of the Collaborative on Faith and Disability is that people with disabilities will have opportunities and supports to develop and express their spirituality and to share those gifts and talents. Our mission is to support people with disabilities, their families, and those who support them by helping to develop and providing national and international leadership in the areas of research, education, service, and dissemination related to disability, religion, and inclusive supports. And there are multiple topics at the intersection of all those areas. Advance, please. Courtney?
Having a little trouble on the slides. Just one
okay. Just so everybody is sympathetic with us today, where Courtney was in a building where the electricity went out about an hour ago, and so she had to pack up and move to another building to do this. Great. And these are some of the UCEDDs, the University Centers of Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, that are part of the collaborative. Each of these has got some interest or some activities or some projects going on, has in the past, or have had done that in the past, and are very interested in these intersections. We are, in fact, just opening now the collaborative up for membership on a wider basis from other UCEDDs and other organizations outside of AUCD, and you can find out. We'll say a little bit more about that at the end of this webinar. Okay. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website. The slides will be posted in a PDF format along with the webinar recording. If you've got questions during this, submit them in the chat box for discussion after the presentations, and we'll read posted questions to the presenters during the Q&A. And at that point, all phone lines need to be silenced so that we're not hearing people speaking. And again, we're going to be starting a new webinar series in January and have 5 in the works for between January and May. Advanced slide, please. Dancing with the Spirits. UCEDDs have 4 primary tasks: training, technical assistance, research, and dissemination. And as people, if you work at a UCEDD, you know most of the funding sources are public, either from the federal government or from state governments or sometimes local governments. Not all, but most. Okay. So for a UCEDD to address the area of spirituality and spiritual supports, it's not a mandated area for them to address, and it's kind of an uneasy fit sometimes, or has been for some university centers. For one, it's without a mandate. There's also little funding available for projects unless it's included under some wider project like community education or family supports or individual supports. There's been a lot of research on spirituality and other areas of health and mental health and on the impact of spiritual supports, but very little really in the field of intellectual and developmental disabilities, and the same is mostly true in the area of disability as a whole. We think that there are probably a lot of people with interest in the area that are that are not known. We don't know it. We've sometimes at AUCD conferences have heard people say that in a primarily scientific environment, sometimes it's hard for people to express an interest in spiritual supports. I don't think that's pervasive, because I think there is more and more interest. But there's also a lack of training, and has been a lack of training for people who are currently faculty and staff at university centers on the inclusion of spiritual preferences and supports in evaluation and planning processes for individuals and families, and certainly in kind of how the collaboration would happen between service agencies and support agencies and congregation. And some may have uncertainty about where it might fit in it's a particular mission or objectives of a given UCEDD. Okay? In some ways, you could think of this as two different worlds without a common language to help the interaction. Religious and spiritual supports don't operate with the same kinds of systems, language, or processes that we see and feel and live in the world of intellectual and developmental disabilities. I think churches, synagogues, mosques, when they look at the world of disability supports and services, see a wide area with a lot of confusing labels, lots of acronyms, and all kinds of services or supports, and thus being uncertain about, and with some uncertainty about how to access them or how they might relate to them as well. And on the flip side, staff at UCEDDs can see a very confusing world of diverse faith traditions and understandings of spirituality. When you look out, you say, well, we'd like to do some work with faith communities. That's a very confusing and diverse world as well, okay? But there are lots of areas where spirituality is simply implicit and inherent in some of the goals and objectives of many of the supports and services and of UCEDDs. Individual and community supports. We talk a lot about natural supports for individuals and families and their importance. And faith communities, congregations are one of the biggest and most ubiquitous natural community support organization that there is in the country. Eric Carter is really good about naming the number of congregations, which happens to be around 340,000. If you think about self-determination and choice, if we say that individuals and families have the right to make their own decisions and to right to make their own choices, then in any kind of service system or support, wherever they are, if faith or spirituality is an important component of their lives, they should have the right to make those decisions and preferences known about that. We talk a lot about cultural competence these days in our supports and in the UCEDDs and in other service systems. I think it's really hard to talk about cultural competence and not deal with the spiritual communities that are at the hearts of many different ethnic cultures or religious cultures in this country. Those organizations, the faith communities, are often the center of many different kinds of ethnic groups or even different parts of the country in terms of community groups. So cultural competence really means you've got to take into account how spiritual traditions might influence a particular culture, even if somebody is not an active member of a congregation or faith community. Then think about the role of faith communities as partners in advocacy. We just heard someone say that at the AUCD meeting on the last plenary, where she was asked about what UCEDDs and LEND programs should be doing these days in relationship to thinking about advocacy with the current state of affairs in our country. And one of the things she said and noted was, I would be making partnerships with faith communities because they are ones that could be a real asset in the advocacy you're doing. And then we think about training of community leaders, of generic community leaders of whatever stripe, whatever role they have. Those are all important roles that for UCEDDs. All right. The UCEDDs working in this area have formed the Collaborative on Faith and Disability. And so today we're highlighting 3 UCEDDs who've worked to integrate those spiritual supports in a variety of ways: Oregon, Minnesota, and Georgia. So people have persisted even with the uncertainty about how to deal with spirituality and learn how to move and work in this area, hence our label for the day of learning how to dance with the spirits and with spirituality in our programs and supports and services. Let's advance the slide and let me welcome the people from Oregon: Rhonda Eppelsheimer, who's the Associate Director, and Joseph Basey, who's on their Community Advisory Council.
Rhonda, are you there?
Oh, hi. I forgot to unmute both. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I love this first slide because it didn't come out the way I had intended. It's kind of messy, and I think that's just a great visual for how we've kind of started, and we've had some real gains and some, and it's been kind of a swirl of work that we've been doing over the last 6 years. We're pleased to have this opportunity to share a quick overview of our work on creating or increasing inclusion in faith practices and spiritual supports for Oregonians who experience disability. And the need to improve the supports really came to light in our grant planning process about 6 years ago from our Community Advisory Board. They lifted up that spiritual support and inclusion in faith communities is important to them and not always considered for people with disabilities. We decided to look into this a little bit deeper, and we can go ahead and advance the slide, please.
Trying to do that now, just 1 second.
During our grant process, we found the following 3 things. People with disabilities want to engage with the respective faith communities, but didn't always know how to engage. Secondly, many spiritual leaders were unaware of how to engage people with disabilities and the support systems in the communities of faith. Then third, there was a lack of awareness of ways in which faith communities can be accommodated. There are misconceptions that accommodations are either too time-consuming or too costly. This in reality isn't the case in many ways.
So as a result, our CPC, our advisory board, directed us to respond to these identified needs and to develop initiatives and projects that support welcome and inclusion of people with disabilities in worship, spiritual practices, and communities of faith. And we began to think about this in terms of partnership with the community. We believe it's the responsibility of individuals, agencies, religious organizations, and communities of faith to work together to help provide opportunities for spiritual and religious expression. We can advance the slide. So our approach really started rooted in our mission. So as a center, we're at a health and science university, and we want to improve the health and quality of life for people with disabilities and their families. And in its very simplest form, we conceptualize health and quality of life in terms of mind, body, and spirit, And spiritual support is certainly included in spiritual health and wellness. So that's how we framed it. We learned that there was a groundswell of emphasis on spiritual supports being addressed in our university centers of excellence across the country and within churches, agencies, and advocacy groups in our own state. And so we began planning activities in two of our core functions that Bill talked about. First, education for professionals, and then second, training for the broader community. We've shared about our work at conferences and are just beginning to develop some research.
We use an inclusive approach called participatory action research, or we call it PAR, to develop research products. PAR is how we involve people with disabilities in all stages of research process. As the research develops, we want to be informed by those who will benefit, so we involve them in design, implementation, analyze, and sharing the results of the research.
And then the third part of our approach was to get connected, so we could become more informed and join in if there was an opportunity to collaborate. So we joined the AUCD National Network Spirituality Special Interest Group and the collaborative, and then we looked for local opportunities, and we found this key partner in the Interfaith Disability Network of Oregon. And this is a group of interested people who were also kind of wanting to lift this up within the community. And we've worked together with both of these connections to learn about resources and develop projects. Next slide, please. So we started with, in 2012, by developing two signature projects. The first one is community engagement grants, and we call them KEG grants. They're small grants for community nonprofits to seed programs in three areas that we emphasize at the UCEDD. One is spiritual support, the second is sibling support, and the third is health promotion. And then the second signature project that we began working on was a training conference with the Interfaith Disability Network of Oregon. And we'll talk about those a little more in depth here. So next slide. So looking a little deeper with the KEG, it's really a funding initiative, and we use some of our core funds each year to activate the community organizations that serve individuals with disabilities and their families, or churches or any nonprofit that's interested in developing these types of support. The KEG program, over the last 5 years, we've awarded over $20,000 in funding, and we've reached nearly 3,000 individuals across Oregon, and nearly half of the projects that have been funded, so about $10,000 of that, has really focused on projects that are improving the spiritual health and inclusion of people with disabilities and their families.
Okay, this program has also provided a platform for the UCEDD CPC, National Advisory Council, to work in collaboration. The UCEDD sends out the request for proposals and applications, and then the CP members review the applications and select the ones to be funded each year. Involvement of our advisory board provides an opportunity for professional development of our council members. We are trained, who are trained in the grant review process and serve as committee members who decide on how the funds are awarded.
And I will say we've kept the definition of spiritual supports broad. The projects have included improving access to physical space, training for clergy, lay, and spiritual leaders, technical assistance programs that help families and churches figure out what specific supports will promote inclusion in their congregational settings, inclusion programming for bar and bat mitzvah preparation, mindfulness, yoga calm practices for kids with disabilities, and then also shared living support in communities such as L'Arche. And you can really easily learn more about these programs at our website. if you just Google OHSU UCEDD Community Engagement Grants, and it kind of gives you a list of the projects and a description. So we can advance the slide. And then the second project that we started with was a conference called Beyond the Ramp, Treat Me as a Member, Not a Mission. And that was presented by the Interfaith Disability Network of Oregon. The UCEDD joined this ecumenical group to increase our capacity for collaboration, training, and information sharing. The conference framework was a full-day format targeting clergy, lay and spiritual leaders, people with disabilities, parents, educators, service agencies, and caseworkers. And then our keynote was our moderator today, Bill Gaventa, and he gave a talk about the importance of developing spiritual supports for people living with disabilities from a theological perspective.
20 workshops include many topics such as inclusion training, advocacy, and spiritual care, and navigating life's transition.
And then finally, one of the highlights of that day really was a panel discussion hosted by the UCEDD of young adults living with disabilities who discussed how they have, with varying degrees of success, engaged with their communities of faith or relied on spiritual practices and support during the time of moving from high school to either college or work or independent living. And they really discussed their real life barriers in terms of faith, and then how things have been really life-giving in their faith communities and very supportive. It was a really instructive and highlight of that conference day. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, we've been at this about 6 years now, and we're always thinking about how we measure progress. We've done some very practical work around trying to measure our impact by collecting evaluation data to learn if people are satisfied with the information we're sharing, if their knowledge has increased, or if they're able to make some changes to be more welcoming. We also collect data on what people would like to learn more about. The bigger question that we're really just beginning to wrestle with is the act of increasing community capacity and advocacy actually moving that dial on those things in the very first slide that Joe talked about that we initially identified? And I think it's really hard to measure, so we're really trying to figure that out to kind of look at a broader impact. And for the future, we're going to continue to go forward with our KEG grants and expanding community collaborations. We hope to expand relationships and get more community members involved. We're just developing this year the framework for our focused externship, and we're putting some of our core funding to start this project for clergy or chaplain or spiritual leader or lay leader to come to the UCEDD and have some in-depth hands-on training over several weeks around inclusion and advocacy. And we will identify professionals who want to develop a capstone project in their community of faith that includes those PAR concepts that Joe was talking about earlier.
The second project is developing research. Our question is as follows: is there a gap between what people with disabilities need to be included and what faith communities feel will help with help and promote inclusion? The gap where we believe the conversation needs to begin. We are planning to launch a survey in Oregon in 2018 and hoping to include other states in the U.S. In the UCEDD network. That's it, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for your patience.
Thank you. And our next presenters are from the University of Minnesota and their Research and Training Center on Community Living. Angela Amado, Julie Kramme, and Anab Gulaib, and take it away.
Thanks so much, Bill. This is Julie Kramme, and I'm going to talk with you just immediately here, real briefly about our center. You can go to the next slide here. We just wanted to give a little bit of brief introduction about the Research and Training Center on Community Living, which is housed within the Institute on Community Integration. At ICI, we are focused on all sorts of projects that are intended to increase community inclusion and integration of people with disabilities. And our focus is across the lifespan. So starting with early intervention through education and transition services and into community living. The three of us work primarily out of community living, but we cross over into some of these other areas so that we can provide support on different projects, again, across the lifespan. On the right here, you'll see some of our major projects within our organization that we work on, and sometimes it's just nice to have that frame of reference of ways that you might have encountered some of our work in the past as you're hearing about the ways that we have worked with faith communities in the last several years. You can move to the next slide. So the first project that we have been a part of is Putting Faith to Work. And instead of spending a ton of time on discussing this really excellent project, I just want to put a plug in for the last webinar that was a part of this series in November. And encourage all listeners to go and listen to that webinar if you haven't already. There's a great description of the project there, as well as some great discussion about how it was implemented in a church context in Tennessee. So we had the pleasure of working on this project as well. I'll talk a little bit about how our model was different. But first, the aims of this project are to increase community employment among people with disabilities. And many folks know that many people with disabilities face lots of barriers when looking for employment in the community. And the aim of this project is to overcome those barriers and to find meaningful work for people with disabilities. So our project goals, I included them there, and I won't go into too much detail about what each of those goals is. Our model differed from that you'll hear on the last webinar in that we did a community scan and identified existing job groups within our community. And we worked within those existing structures. And the great thing is that these job groups were already doing to help them to broaden their influence, broaden their the ways that they serve folks with disabilities, and to promote inclusion in the groups. So this looked like lots of different things, but some presentations on inclusion within those groups and other sorts of job skills, and identifying those barriers that people face and overcoming them. In other cases, it looked like job coaching, and in some cases working individually with folks to overcome whatever it was that, whatever kind of barrier that they were facing to getting into a job that was meaningful to them. And the intervention was successful in many cases. So we are continuing to work with some of these faith communities and continuing to provide support as needed. And that's definitely something that we look to do going forward, as well as to continue increasing the sustainability of some of the things that we've done within these faith communities over the last several years. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Angela to talk a little bit more about several of the projects that we've been working on.
Great. So Bill had said at the beginning that that there wasn't any specific funding for UCEDDs to work on spirituality, but we have been successful in the last many 5-year rounds of our Central Research and Training Center funding. Those of you who are from different UCEDDs. So because we have a focus on community living, we've actually been able to identify specific projects around spirituality and have those have those be part of some of our other projects. So that's how we've been able to be successful in working with many different faith communities. So I've worked for almost 30 years now on social inclusion. So we've had a focus, our RTC has had a focus on social inclusion as part of community living. So everybody knows people say people are in the community, but not of the community. And so I've worked with many, many provider agencies, both in Minnesota and in other states over the years in terms of expanding social inclusion for people. And in those particular projects, one of the lessons we've learned is that faith communities have been a really extraordinary resource. We have many, many, many examples of support agencies that have been successful in including the people that they support in faith communities, expanding their membership in different groups within a faith community, being befriended by other congregation members, etc. So it's been a really, really great resource. This thing that's on the slide right now is the manual that I've written that some of you may already know, but if you don't, it's downloadable and free. And if you work with any kind of provider agencies, it has the lessons that we've learned about working with staff, influencing staff, what do agencies have to deal with to increase social inclusion. As part of that is increasing their membership and belonging in faith communities and the expression of their spiritual support. So we've had, as I said, over the years, many successes in that, like meeting with ministerial committees in different areas and having congregations commit to that. So, and on the next slide, one of the other things we had in one of our major RTC rounds was evaluations actually of 2 national congregational programs regarding whether these programs, these 2 programs influence social inclusion or not, and to what degree that they did. That's the report that's on the left, which you can certainly access once you get the slides. You can access that report also. So the 2 congregational programs were the Befrienders Ministry, which is now actually in 40 states, as well as the Accessible Congregations Campaign, which had a commitment by the year 2000 to have 2,000 congregations commit to increased inclusion and membership and addressing barriers in their congregations. We did a follow-up after that to see what impact that campaign had on the congregations, whether they were continuing their particular efforts. And in this report, there's examples of definitely when congregations take on particular commitments in this particular area, that there's many beautiful examples of people being befriended by other congregation members, what other congregation members learn about people with disabilities, how they learn to love and accept people, as well as the different barriers and issues that the congregations had to deal with in terms of opening their hearts to people and to including people. So, and then on the next slide is we've also had some meetings with the Luther Seminary in terms of joint support. So we supported a disability day that the seminary had for both their faculty and their students, seminary-wide day, and found out particular needs that they have. Those of you who, from UCEDD, who we found out many seminaries actually need more support about. Sometimes they have students who have disabilities themselves, as well as what kind of instruction do they provide to people who will be ministers or other leaders in their congregations in the future in terms of how they include and relate to people of different kinds of disabilities. So then over to Anab.
Hi, can you hear me? The slide that you see is a picture of our community report, the Minneapolis-Somali Autism Spectrum Disorder Project, which was actually a research under the early intervention area cycle, and it was completed in 2013. It ran between 2011 and 2013. And then on the other side, you see the CDC 2016 prevalence report, which is 1 in 68. And then on top of that, you see the ADAM logo, which is our current autism prevalence study. And we are part of the CDC ADAM network, which is a multi-source public health surveillance project that monitors the prevalence of autism spectrum across the country. We are one of the networks, and we in Minnesota have a particular focus on the ethnicity and co-occurring conditions, and that includes the Somali and the Hmong community as a populations. And so what does that have to do with the faith community? Well, in the Somali community, autism wasn't a concerning issue, and it was a sensitive issue in that it was a public health issue that also kind of crossed in immunization, because there was a lot of fear about autism and immunization connection. So there was a lot that needed to be unveiled, and there's a lot that needed to be untangled. And many research institutes or centers or people who are doing research have to deal with similar scenarios. And you saw earlier slides at the beginning that health education and partnership with faith community have been shown to be one of the values associated with working with faith community. So in our research in this particular, and working with a particular ethnicity and particular community group, the work and relationship we had with the local faith community played a role in calming the fear that the community had, but also communicating the scope of the studies or the research projects, and also to ensure participation of our people to use it as an opportunity to build awareness about autism, but also educate them about the value or the intention of our study. And so just to give you a little bit of background about the Somali community, Minnesota has the largest Somali community in the U.S. It's predominantly Muslim, and faith is very strongly linked to their cultural values. It's very important people do also feel closer to their faith in times of need. So certainly they rely on faith as a component of holistic approach to not only inclusion, but also as a strategy to stay connected to as part of their well-being. So we use the faith as part of that strategies. It wasn't a formal relationship, but it was an opportunity for us to work with the faith community, but also to understand how to build connections with the community. So the next slide. Here I put some points about some strategies that we've learned or lessons learned in working in these two projects, the ongoing one and the one that's completed. Again, working with the faith community is a really great way to build trust with communities, no matter where they are from, but especially working with the Somali community. It's a great way to promote sensitive messages and to work with faith leaders who are seen as influencers. And it's a great way to tap into how people communicate. So in the cause of the Somalis, they are very oral communities, so that helped a lot. It's a great way to engage in health education. And for our projects, because we didn't have a formal grant-given component to how we did our projects, we've worked with the faith community because they were invested in this issue. It was part of them responding to the issues that their congregations were bringing up. So they really put in a lot of their own in-kind time to work with us. They participated in advisory board. They were part of a panel speakers, part of videos. They opened their doors for us to talk to their faith followers in their different mosques. And so that was kind of one of the ways that we work with them. And then I put a little advice there about not to assume everybody addresses disability. So often you might hear, work with faith community, especially if you're trying to talk about disability or sensitive issues. It's really important to understand the person that you're working in the faith community is somebody who understands about what it is that you're trying to communicate there. You are communicating along the same values, that they understand medicine and the connection between science and faith. So you don't want someone to, and the understanding of disability and autism or any issue within the faith community is going to be in a spectrum on its own. So there is an opportunity to understand how can we, where do we fit in, where people understand about the issues, and give them an opportunity to understand the scope of your project. And then the next slide. And this is a slide that shows the recent measles outbreak, again, in the Somali community and the faith community, how it was an example in which, yes, you had the state addressing this, you have the counties doing epidemiology work, you have all the public health stuff happening, clinics and everything, but the role of the community, faith community, cannot be underemphasized, that they were everywhere and anywhere, and they participated in every aspect of it until the measles outbreak was contained. So I just put it in there just to show you that this is kind of a big deal for our community. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Amad. And yeah, thank you very much. I've had the privilege of visiting the University of Minnesota Center and went to part of the program. It was part of the outreach to the Somali community. It's really, really interesting program and terrific. Now we're going to move on to, and you'll see here on the last slide from them, some of the people that many of you might know who've been connected to the Center for Community Integration. It was a great center. So we're going to move on to Georgia with Mark Crenshaw.
Good afternoon. So as Bill said, I'm Mark Crenshaw, and I have had the pleasure of working at the University Center in Atlanta, Georgia State University since 2011. And so about, well, when we did our last needs assessment related to our 5-year plan with our center, one of the conversations that really sort of came up and there was a lot of energy around with our community advisory committee was sort of how do we sort of get into increased conversations and sort of effective conversations about partnering around inclusion in congregations, faith settings. And I just gave you some points about sort of our rationale around that. You know, and so our center sort of engaged in these conversations first because we know that the research says that participation and belonging in faith communities plays a great role in resilience and coping for individuals and families who are impacted with disabilities. The second part of that is, you know, so obviously congregations are going to be an important place for connecting with community in the American South, and so it felt important to us to engage in that for that reason. And then, you know, obviously, I had come to the UCEDD from essentially 3 community-based organizations over 3 years doing some of this work with congregations. And so, you know, I came with a real interest in the conversation and just really happened to, my coming here just really happened to coincide with the initiation of the collaborative. So it was a really good time to sort of look at that and look at the resources nationally and the conversations going on. And so I'm just really grateful for the ability to engage in this conversation with folks in centers across the country. And then because there's a real commitment in our pre-service training for professionals around sort of around leadership specifically, we really wanted to look at the potential to use sort of pre-service training as an opportunity to engage emerging leaders from the faith community. And so, for instance, last year we did have a trainee in our leadership education in neurodevelopmental disabilities program, which is the way that we part of the way that we fulfill our interdisciplinary training function for our UCEDD. We had a gentleman who was a pastor, and so really saw some benefits of having a leader, sort of from the faith community with a faith voice as part of our cohort. And I feel like what he taught us and what he taught his colleagues in the training program was really, really valuable. And also, we have evaluation feedback from the gentleman and his colleagues that it really did make a difference to have him be a part, and that he benefited from the exposure as well. So that's just a little bit about the rationale. The next few slides are sort of just about some things that we have been engaged in since our last 5-year plan. We got really fortunate in the context of some relationship with a local seminary, Columbia Theological Seminary, which is a Presbyterian Church USA seminary in Decatur, Georgia, which is right near us. And they had new leadership come in. The dean of their seminary came to them from a seminary, Western Theological Seminary, and that was a place where there was a commitment to sort of education and training around including the voices and experiences of people with disabilities in congregations, and sort of having open dialogue with emerging leaders for congregations about how to do that. And so the folks at Columbia reached out to our UCEDD to sort of have a broader conversation in the context of a conference for mostly active religious educators around sort of, what's the bigger picture of of a life for a family who has a loved one with a disability, and how can we give our congregation some different tools to be engaged in that conversation. So that conference included content around inclusion and in education and worship, but it also sort of included invitations to be involved in larger conversations. So one of the photos, the one in the bottom left, is Stacey Ramirez, who does some work in Georgia around person-centered planning. And so she presented to the attendees about how congregations can be active participants in person-centered planning processes for individuals with disabilities, and it was a very well-received session. So, next slide. We just recently have begun some conversations with the folks at the L'Arche in the U.S. region about sort of how they can continue to build on their efforts to include the voices and experiences of core members in L'Arche, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who live in L'Arche, in leadership in the organization. And so, for instance, we were just with them a couple of weeks ago and did a presentation about sort of implementing universal design for learning, sort of organizationally, and how that might help them meet, how that was one model to potentially help them meet their goal to be more inclusive of everyone who is kind of a stakeholder in L'Arche. You can go to the next slide. The next thing that I wanted to mention is that through the Columbia Theological Seminary, sort of building on the first conference I mentioned that we did in 2016, we're now getting an opportunity to do sort of a longer-term online learning course around including people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in leadership in your congregation. I am co-facilitating that online course with Bethany McKinney-Fox, and she was a partner in the initial conference in 2016 as well. And so like I said, there seems to be a commitment from this particular seminary to engage current students in conversations, but also to reach out to folks in congregations to do training to sort of help provide some resources to folks in the field, which is exciting. And the other sort of piece of this conversation for me has also been sort of how do we sort of connect folks who are doing work in their congregations with their university centers for excellence in development of disabilities. And so there's been some of the ongoing conversation with the folks in the seminary is around sort of thinking intentionally about where these religious education professionals work, what the congregational setting is like, and whether the university center might have resources to support them in doing their work. You can go to the next slide. We've just began, so this is our third exposure with the folks at Columbia Seminary, but we've just begun planning for a conference that will take place in the spring of 2019. That will be another in-person conference with students and religious educators in the Columbia community. Folks from the Metro Atlanta area have also, we've sort of thrown the net pretty wide. But the thing I like about this partnership with the seminary is, they might have, and often seminaries do have, sort of resources to think theologically, and maybe resources to think about inclusion in worship and study and service in their congregations. But I think the partnership with the University Center has helped them think about sort of the lives of individuals and families, the lives of people with disabilities and their families, and the ways that congregations can be engaged in supporting families outside of, supporting them to attend services or participate in congregational meetings, participate in education. I think as a result of some of these conversations, we've had some really interesting follow-up conversations with educators about how the congregation can be engaged with individuals and their families outside of the setting of the congregation. And so that's been a real benefit. I would just say that in terms of sort of some of my thinking, some of our strategic thinking about this, the other piece that is really attractive to me about this partnership, ongoing partnership with Columbia Seminary, is the opportunity to interact with current students and to really offer some tools to think about and consider being in community with people with disabilities and their families that might be sort of different than the tools that their education up to this point has offered them. And so, my hope is that over time we have opportunities to sort of encourage relationships that are on the basis of understanding what individuals with disabilities and their families might contribute to a congregation in a different way. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to all the presenters. And if those of you who are on the webinar, if you've got some questions, you can use the chat room session to send them in, even if we don't get to answer them all today, which is a good chance if you've got some, because we're getting close. We will get back to you with answers or get them to particular people who have some answers or ideas. There are other examples of other UCEDDs that are doing things. Of course, the Kennedy Center that's hosting this webinar, and the collaborative website. And they've done a variety of research and training activities through their UCEDD under the leadership of Eric Carter and Courtney Evans-Taylor. Arkansas has been working with congregations around training in autism. The Colorado LEND program has had a trainee, their LEND trainee from an alliance and a partnership with Iliff Seminary. So there's been a seminary in the LEND program. And also one of those trainees has recently done work in respite care and faith communities and training related to that. Next slide. So think about the UCEDDs as serving as a port of entry into the worlds of disability for clergy and congregations who are seeking help. I mean, the UCEDDs represent kind of an entry place that can then refer people out in ways, or also provide them with some tools and things to continue a journey as congregations and clergy begin to look more at inclusive ministries. Think about your UCEDD or the University Center as a safe and neutral territory where a diversity of faith communities can come together. If you try to have interfaith or multi-faith meetings in different communities, sometimes it makes a lot of difference who's sponsoring that and where it's held. And so to be a place where faith communities can come together, that's not under the umbrella of one faith community or another, provides an opportunity for as many different people to be involved as possible. Think also about inclusion of people of clergy and seminary students in training activities and dissemination out to faith communities or networks in faith communities within your state that deal with disability through different denominational or faith groups. And as you have individuals and families come through your center for evaluations or other kinds of supports or services, and they mentioned something about the role of spirituality or their feelings about that or experience, UCEDDs can have a role of being the asker on behalf of individuals and families, of being willing to say, would you like us to talk with your congregation, your clergyman, or with a congregation about this? We'd be glad to help out and provide them some ideas, because sometimes individuals and families get tired of asking. The potential benefits for UCEDDs, there's a growing number of faith-based supports for individuals. Do you know where they are in your state, and do they know you? They are potential allies in advocacy, community education, and service development. And they also have networks, national and within your state, that can help disseminate information to individuals and families. Next slide. And also think about reaching out to the seminaries in your state. Many are trying to figure out ways to include disability in the curriculum, as Mark has illustrated, and also the Luther Seminary in Minnesota. And there are also clinical pastoral education programs in most major hospitals, especially medical centers. And that's where a lot of UCEDDs have connections as well to university-based medical centers. Clinical pastoral education programs are training students in a variety of different kinds of training and links of training who will meet people with disabilities when they're in the hospital and their families, but also will meet them in congregations. Offer to provide training sessions for them around disability topics, or invite some of the students to be parts of the UCEDD training activities, or even perhaps to be in your LEND program. Next slide. So a question. We have one question. Our congregation is small. We have a few folks with IDD and physical and mental health disabilities who are members. We're open to including other adults or families, but don't know how to find these folks. I sent letters last year to our local DD service coordinators, our community boards, inviting people to attend, but got no response. We're happy to be inclusive, but just not sure how to reach out. Would someone from our presenters like to take a stab at that question?
This is Rhonda Eppelsheimer out in Oregon, and while I've worked at the UCEDD, I also have been working within my own congregation to do this very thing. And I think what it's really come down to for us is one of the strategies as a congregation is we did a season of inviting people in from that have some knowledge and expertise or have family members or loved ones who experience disability, and did kind of adult forums to come educate and share their story with our congregation. And then through that, we met folks that lived in our community, whether that be in group homes or other serving agencies, and we were able to actually invite some individuals who experience disability then to come in and do an adult forum and help us understand what would be things that would make our congregation more welcoming. And, you know, we've had some ups and downs in success with that, but I think it's just really getting out there and doing that relational piece. I can say with the service agencies and the state agencies, while they try to include that in planning, I think a lot of them are pretty overwhelmed, and so it's not, you know, just a letter is probably not gonna reach out, but maybe try to identify one or two people that have some connection to the disability community in your community and work on that relationship and try to figure out ways that you can be start from an approach of listening.
And the people who are involved may have some ideas about family connections and networks. We're going to need to move on. If you've got questions, please send them to us. Courtney, can we look at the final slides? We have update. The webinars are coming. We're aiming for third Wednesdays of each month. February is Jewish Disabilities Month, Disability Awareness Month, and they do a lot during that month, lots of different things, and we thought it's an important piece for people to know about. The collaborative website, we would invite you to come and take a look at some of the different resources that are on the collaborative website, which we're trying to continue to expand. And next slide. And that's the end of the slideshow. I don't know, that was the last slide. But also, so take a look around the website. If you've got questions related to this, we'd be glad to follow up with you. You could send an email to Courtney or send an email to Eric Carter or to me, Bill Gaventa, at gmail.com, bill.gaventa, or you've got the emails on the slides, which will be up in PDF form on the website. Thanks to all of our presenters for being part of this from the East to the West Coast. And thank you, Courtney, for fighting through a number of barriers today to help this to happen. We greatly appreciate it, and we wish everyone a blessed holidays, Hanukkah, Christmas, Kiwanis, Kwanzaa, whatever your particular tradition. Be well. Thank you.